So before I get started, I do want to let everybody know that I do have notes of this presentation. I always love it when I see people that are taking notes, but if you want to put your pen and paper down and just relax, practically everything word for word I'm going to be saying is in these notes. And then in the appendix, if you enjoy the topic and if you'd like to dig a little bit deeper, there is a lot more in the appendix. This is probably one of my thicker set of notes that I've put together. There's about 4 times as much in the appendix as there is in the presentation itself. A lot of it dives deeper into the points that I'm making in this presentation, and some of it was just additional information that I just didn't have time to put in this presentation. So, the first 5 books of the Bible, which are Genesis through Deuteronomy, are known as the Pentateuch. And for thousands of years, the stories, the events that are detailed in the Pentateuch, like the flood of Noah, the rise of Moses in Egypt, Israel's exodus from Egypt, their entry into the Promised Land, were presumed, traditionally understood to have been written by Moses and pretty much assumed to be historically accurate and true. However, with the rise of biblical criticism in the last 200 years, that has begun to be questioned. So, in the late 1800s, drawing upon the work of others, Julius Wellhausen put forth what is known as the documentary hypothesis. The documentary hypothesis is a theory which proposes that the Pentateuch as we have it today, over time, was produced from 4 source documents called the Yahwist source, the Elohist, the Deuteronomist, and the priestly code, or the priestly source. Now, the theory is that the Yahwist source was probably written during the United Monarchy, probably during the time of Solomon, a good 500 years after Moses supposedly recorded the events. And then they believed that the Elohist document was written sometime after that, probably written during the divided monarchy, and then those 2 documents were redacted and combined. And then sometime during the Josianic Reformation in the very late 600s BC, they believed that the Deuteronomist source or document was written and was redacted into the previous 2. And then finally, after the Babylonian exile in the 5 to 400s BC, the priestly source was written, and then that was redacted into the previous 3, and that's how we got the Pentateuch as we know it today, a good 1,000 years after Moses supposedly wrote and transmitted. And so consequently, the longer the period of time, the events that supposedly happened, and when they were actually recorded, then the less reliable many people think that those events could possibly be. And so I think that the archaeologist Amahi Matsar echoes the beliefs of many when he notes, "I imagine the historical perspective in the Hebrew Bible as a telescope looking back in time. The further in time we go back, the more dim the picture becomes. The further away we get from the supposed events, the stories become more imagination and symbolic, and perhaps accompanied by a greater distortion of earlier information." So the documentary hypothesis at this point is still very speculative and hypothetical. There is no physical evidence that those sources as described exist. No ancient writer has ever referred to these particular sources, and with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, there was nothing in that gave physical evidence to these sources. Despite that, the documentary hypothesis has been very influential with moderate and liberal Bible scholars, and many of them hold to one form or another of this theory. Now, one of the main arguments that was used in the late 1800s to support this theory was that there didn't appear to be any evidence that Israel actually possessed the technology to write. There was no evidence of a Hebrew script or a Hebrew language at that time. And so the belief was that these earliest books of the Bible, these stories were probably transmitted orally century after century after century. And of course, as we all know from the telephone game, the end result was very unlikely to represent any sort of true and accurate reality. Now, erosion in the confidence of the Bible probably reached a low in the 1990s with the rise of what is known as biblical minimalism. Minimalists tend to think that the vast majority of the Old Testament was written during the Persian or even some 1,000 years after the events were supposedly recorded by Moses. Minimalists think that the Old Testament is full of myth and historical invention, and that the amount of true and accurate history which can be found in the Old Testament is negligible, or minimal, as they're called. In 1992, Philip Davies asserts, "The Israel of the biblical literature is, at least for the most part, obviously not an historical entity at all. Biblical scholars actually know and write that most of the biblical period consists not only of unhistorical persons and events, but even of tracts of time that do not belong in history at all. The fact is then that our, quote, ancient Israel is not the biblical literary entity, nor a historical one. It is a scholarly creation deemed essential to the pursuit of biblical studies." Now, this is going to be the first in a series of presentations I'm going to do on biblical archaeology. So what I would like to do is begin by taking a look at the biblical timeline as best we know it. So if you look at this timeline, we're going to be focusing on the Exodus and the period of the Judges. And so according to 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, we're told that Solomon began to build his temple during the 4th year of his reign, which we can date to 966 BC. Now, this is one of the earliest dates that we have the highest degree of confidence that we know that that date is correct. We've been able to triangulate the Israeli ancient calendar with the Assyrian calendar and with the Egyptian calendars in order to come up with this date. So we have a high degree of confidence in that date of 966 BC. Now, that verse also states that it was 480 years after Israel had left Egypt. So if that's correct, the Exodus would be dated to 1446 BC. And so using those two dates, we can estimate other historical events. So if the date of Exodus is 1446 BC, then the Israelites would have wandered in the wilderness for a good 40 years, putting their arrival in Canaan, in the Promised Land, at about 1406 BC, roughly somewhere in that time frame. If that's correct, then the period of the Judges would have been from the very early 1300s, say 1390 or so, to approximately 1050 BC, when Saul would become the first king of Israel, and that would be the rise of what's known as the monarchy, or more specifically, the United Monarchy. Now, not listed on here, I do want to point out that off to the left, we are also told that Jacob and Joseph and their families entered and settled in Egypt 430 years before the Exodus, and so that would be about 1876 BC. We'll be referring to the 1800 BC here in just a moment. Just thought it'd be good for you to know that. Now, it's important to also know that Bible scholars are split when it comes to the dating of the Exodus. So this is considered to be the more straightforward traditional reading of the biblical text. However, there are some more moderate and liberal scholars, as well as archaeologists, who believe that a 13th century Exodus better fits the archaeological record. And so they tend to date the Exodus in the very early 1200s, like 1290 to 1275 BC. And so consequently, anything prior to the Exodus, they date about 150 years later than do traditional Bible scholars. Now, I just wanted you to know that as a side note. For our purposes, we're going to be using what is considered to be the more traditional timeline. Now, the Pentateuch, the books of Joshua and Judges, each refer to specific persons possessing and specifically using the technology of writing. So, for example, in Exodus chapter 24, we're told that Moses then wrote down everything that the Lord had said. Then he took the book of the covenant and he read it to the people. And then in Joshua chapter 24, we're told that on that day, Joshua made a covenant for the people. And there at Shechem, he drew up for them the decrees and the laws, and Joshua recorded these things in the book of the law of God. Now, 2 points real quick. There are numerous passages that relate to them using it. This is just a sample. The other thing, remember Shechem. We're going to come back to Shechem later. Just remember that here, during the conquest and their entry, the Israelites are in Shechem. They possess it. So critical Bible scholars who date these writings to much later periods see this as evidence of what's called an anachronism. An anachronism is when something appears in an incorrect historical or chronological setting. So, for example, if I was reading a book that was supposedly set in the 1980s, and the author described a character pulling out a smartphone and then sending a text or receiving a text, well, anybody who lived in the 1980s know that that would be an anachronism. There's no such thing as smartphones in the 80s. We didn't send or receive texts. So these scholars who date these writings much later and see this as an anachronism think that this is evidence that you have a later author that is inserting or projecting an inaccurate history into this text. And if they make this type of error, because they're obviously just making it up, they're just inventing it, okay, then what can you trust? Is there anything in the Bible, especially the early parts of the Bible, that you can trust? So therefore, our focus in this presentation is going to be looking for evidence that the Israelites could have recorded the historical events detailed in the books of Joshua and Judges during the period of the Judges, somewhere between the 14th and 10th century BC. And the other question is, does the archaeological or historical record correspond with the events and or the historical period that's described in Joshua and Judges? So the Sumerians are widely recognized as having invented the technology of writing. And then soon thereafter, other Mesopotamian powers like the Egyptians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, they came up with their own methods of writing. Now initially, they used hieroglyphic pictures or these wedge-shaped cuneiform marks representing whole words. And that worked for 1,500 to 2,000 years. It worked just fine for recording history and for communicating. Now, the Egyptologist Sir William Flinders Petrie is recognized by many to be the really first modern-day archaeologist. And in 1905, while excavating at the old turquoise mines of Serabit el-Qadim in the Sinai Peninsula, his wife Hilda, who's pictured there, actually noticed a set of Egyptian hieroglyphs that were being used in an unusual way. So they were here at these turquoise mines in Serabit el-Qadim in the Sinai Peninsula. I'm going to go ahead and point out Wadi el-Hol that we'll refer to here in a moment. So Petrie began to study these hieroglyphs, and he began to think. Now, he couldn't read them initially, but as he began to study them, he began to think that perhaps they were being used alphabetically. If so, they thought, we may have just discovered the very earliest use of an alphabet. And so in 1916, Sir Alan Gardner was able to decipher this alphabet, and he confirmed that they were being used alphabetically to put together words, and also discovered that these were Canaanite words. So the picture that then began to emerge was that Semites working at the turquoise mines in Egypt appear to have invented the alphabet. And this is the scholarly opinion that's held today. These hieroglyphic letters that have been securely dated to the middle of the 19th century, about the 1850s BC, which would have been just after Jacob and Joseph and their families would have entered Egypt according to our biblical time frame. Now, just over 20 years ago, other inscriptions dating to the same time frame were found at Wadi el-Hol in Egypt, and combined, these earliest alphabetic inscriptions have come to be called the Proto-Sinaitic script. It is currently believed that every alphabet in the world descended from this Proto-Sinaitic script. Now, the invention of the alphabet was a huge jump in human technology. It was on par with the invention of the wheel, the invention of language, and even writing itself, because this would allow literacy to be available to the masses, to all of humanity, as opposed to just simply the elite governmental scribes. The elite scribes, they had to memorize hundreds and hundreds and even into the thousands of hieroglyphic pictures or wedge-shaped cuneiform combinations just to have a minimal vocabulary. With the alphabetic writing, you only had to know 20 to 30 of these shapes, and you just had to know the sounds that they made in order to phonetically be able to read and write. Now, from that point, obviously, the alphabet evolved and changed over the years. So we just talked about the Proto-Sinaitic script that dates to about 1850. Now you notice there's a huge jump in the evolution in this table between the Proto-Sinaitic and the Phoenician script, and that's because in the middle there's a script called the Proto-Canaanite script. And the Proto-Canaanite script is where you see most of the evolution of the alphabet. The stances of the letters were very fluid and were changing, and they were simplifying the pictures into more like stick figure drawings that eventually would become the letters. The direction of the writing was changing. Sometimes you would write from left to right. Sometimes you would write from right to left. Sometimes they would write via what's called bostrophodon. Bostrophodon is when you start from one side, you write to the other side, and then you just drop down to the next line and you go back writing that way. They call it as the ox plows. Now, the ancient epigrapher Orley Goldwasser calls the Proto-Canaanite script the script of the poor, or the caravan script, because the Proto-Canaanite script, the only evidence we have for it is being used by lay people. We don't have any evidence of any government scribes picking up that script and using it. We don't have evidence of this script on any sort of monument. So there was a long period of evolution between the Proto-Sinaitic script and then the Phoenician script that we begin to see in the 1200s. And so it was in the 1200s that we see a standardization being applied to the script. The theory is that the Phoenicians, with their scribal apparatus, then began to formalize and standardize the script, and because of their international relations and their great mercantile activity, that script then began to radiate out to other kingdoms and territories around the Mediterranean and even beyond. And so eventually, the Israelites and their monarchic scribal system would adopt their own distinctive script, and for some, this would be the earliest evidence that we have that Israel actually possessed the technology of writing. Now, somewhat ironically, the earliest example of a Hebrew script which enjoys wide acceptance is the script of the Moabite stone monument celebrating a Moabite rebellion and newfound independence from Israelite rule. The rebellion is detailed in 2 Kings chapter 3, and this monument, known as the Merneptah Stele, confirms the biblical story, but from the Moabite perspective. Now, what's interesting is if the Bible is nothing but myth and invented history, then why do we find these evidence from other kingdoms confirming the biblical stories? Actually, there are a lot of examples of this where we have found archaeological evidence that do confirm the biblical stories. Now, this stele dates to the mid-9th century, which is about 850 to 840 BC. And so again, for many, this is the earliest widely accepted example of a Hebrew script in writing. However, the following are some other inscriptions that have been discovered that have been suggested as perhaps being the earliest Hebrew script. The first is known as the Gezer calendar. So this was discovered in 1908 at Gezer, and this inscription is believed to have been a schoolboy's tablet recording the agricultural calendar. It has evidence of previous writing which had been wiped away, suggesting that it was a reusable writing surface. Gezer became an Israelite city in the mid-10th century, and many date this inscription to the late 10th century. The eminent Harvard epigrapher Frank Cross is quoted as stating, "I believe that the first rudimentary innovations that will make the emergent Hebrew script can be perceived in the Gezer calendar, and since its discovery, many had suggested this to be the earliest example of a Hebrew script and writing." The next one is called the Tel Zayit Abecedary. An abecedary is an alphabet that's written out for rudimentary education. And in 2006 at Tel Zayit, the archaeologist Ron Tappy discovered an abecedary that was written on a stone boulder, which subsequently had been used in the construction of a house or a building. And so that building had been destroyed by fire late in the 10th century. But it was clear that the abecedary had been written on the stone prior to its being used in the construction of the building. As one of the few inscriptions that can be dated from an archaeological context, as opposed to dating it strictly paleographically. Paleographically is when you just date it from the writing itself. Tappy dated the inscription on the stone to the mid-10th century. When the find was published, they brought in the ancient epigrapher Kyle McCarter Jr. to assess the inscription, and he noted, "We may reasonably associate it with the nascent kingdom of Judah. The appearance of an abbecedery in an outlying town some distance from the capital city of Jerusalem demonstrates a movement toward literacy in the extreme western frontier of the kingdom during the mid-10th century BCE. The designation Proto-Hebrew is entirely accurate and proper in view of the fact that the sole heir to the Tel Zayit script will be the Hebrew national script. The next example is known as the Caiapha ostracon. An ostracon is a broken piece of pottery or a potsherd, and it was a very common medium for writing short text or messages. In 2010, an ostracon with 5 lines of text was discovered during an excavation at Tel Caiapha. And so the following is from an article that was published in the secular magazine, Biblical Archaeology Review, talking about the find. They note, the piece de resistance of the Caiapha excavation was found in a substantial structure near the first city gate discovered. It is a 5-line, 6 by 6 inch ostracon, an inscription on a broken piece of pottery. Joseph Garfinkel believes that the language is Hebrew, and the date is clear, early 10th century BCE. In Garfinkel's view, therefore, the Caiapha ostracon is the oldest Hebrew inscription ever discovered. The ostracon has further implications, however. It establishes Hebrew literacy in the Israelite population as early as the kingdom of David and Solomon. And then finally, we have what's known as the Isbet Sarta abbecedery. In 1978, an ostracon was discovered during an excavation at Isbet Sarta, and it contains over 80 letters written in 5 lines. Now, it would appear to be another exercise tablet for a student, as the letters are poorly written, appear to start off as an abbecedery, but then it just trails off into just a random scattering of individual letters. The following is from the original excavators' report. They note, we suspect that they are random exercises in writing letters by a student scribe. Now, based upon the shape and the form of the letters, we can date the Isbet Sarta sherd more precisely to about 1200 BC. The Isbet Sarta sherd's 12th century date makes it the oldest Hebrew abbecedery yet discovered from the Iron Age. And we believe Isbet Sarta is an Israelite settlement. The summary of the evidence, which they detailed in their paper, leaves little doubt that Isbet Sarta was an Israelite town. Now, although the Isbet Sarta sherd does not indicate how widespread popular literacy was in the day of the Judges, it does substantiate the fact that writing was a medium already adopted by the Israelite tribes for administrative purposes. So as just noted, the ostracon dates to 1200 BC, which is in the middle of our period of the Judges. As such, it is a very important piece of evidence supporting the notion that the tribes of Israel, at least 150 years prior to the establishment of the monarchy, were making use of a written medium, with teaching instruction being communicated and practiced. Now, in 2012, Christopher Ralston, who is an internationally recognized ancient epigrapher who specializes in ancient Near East inscriptions, he submitted an article that was published in that secular magazine, Biblical Archaeology Review. The title of that article was, "So what is the oldest Hebrew inscription?" One by one, he reviewed each one of the 4 finds that we discussed. One by one, he dismissed each one of them as being Hebraic. In his summation, he stated, at the end of the day, I conclude that none of this quartet of inscriptions can be declared the winner of the title, quote, the earliest Hebrew inscription. The script of the Caiapha ostracon is early alphabetic. That's another name for Proto-Canaanite. Those are the same thing. Certainly not Hebrew. And it contains no distinctive linguistic features that would allow us to define the language as Old Hebrew. Much of the same can be said of the language of the Gezer calendar, and the script of the Gezer calendar falls nicely within the Phoenician script series. The Tel Zayit abbecedery is a fine Phoenician script that falls well within the Phoenician script series. And finally, the script of the Isbet Sarta abbecedery is early alphabetic, again, Proto-Canaanite. In short, the earliest Hebrew inscriptions come from the period that post-date the inscriptions from Caiapha, Gezer, Tel Zayit, and Isbet Sarta. Now, in 2012, the first time that I read that article, I distinctly remember finishing the article and thinking, well, that's pretty misleading, or at least I thought that it was very misleading. Now, in his defense, after reading some of his other peer-reviewed published articles and reading his book, I can tell you it was not intentionally misleading. However, I thought that it was misleading to anyone who would have thought that it undermined the evidence that Israel actually possessed the technology to write and that they were able to record history at that particular time. Because I remember thinking, but if these are all Israeli settlements, if we have confidence that that is true and we're finding this evidence of writing and these inscriptions in these Israeli settlements, that could still be evidence that Israel possessed the technology of writing. They were just simply using the script of their Canaanite and Phoenician neighbors. Now, for that to carry any weight, for that hypothesis or theory to be believable, we have to have some amount of confidence that those were, in fact, Israeli settlements. So, what's the evidence for that? Well, recall how from the Bible we know that Israel left Egypt. They wandered in the desert, in the wilderness for 40 years, and then they entered Canaan with the conquest and then also the period of the Judges. Well, we know that from an archaeological perspective that beginning in the 13th century, roughly the 1200s BC, there is a sizable demographic increase of people settling in Canaan at that time. So the archaeologist William Dever notes, such a dramatic, quote, population explosion simply cannot be accounted for by natural increase alone, much less by positing small groups of pastoral nomads settling down. Large numbers of people migrated here from somewhere else, strongly motivated to colonize an underpopulated fringe area of urban Canaan. So these new settlers possess some very distinctive architectural, political, and religious markers that distinguish them from the other Canaanites and from the Philistines in the nearby area. So, for example, you begin to see a proliferation of U-shaped courtyard houses called the pillared house or the four-room house. This was a very distinctive yet common floor plan found among all these new settlements, and there were virtually no predecessors of this dwelling form before this time and place in Canaan. We begin to see the settlement in the steeply sloping forested hill country requiring these large-scale terracing in order to manufacture land which was suitable for agricultural use. Silos needed for grain storage due to agricultural production begin to appear at this time. We begin to see the first large-scale use of water cisterns, often lime-plastered water cisterns that are being used to store water. We begin to see a very basic, plain, undecorated pottery is consistent with these new villages, which is distinctive from the Philistine neighbors. There's a complete absence of temples, sanctuaries, and or shrines of any type in these new villages, which is in sharp contrast to the preceding time period, as well as their neighbors. Pigs were very popular with the Philistines, and less so, but still utilized by other populations in Canaan. However, there is an almost complete absence of pig bones that are found in these new villages, and there is no indication of any central governing authority. There's no evidence of a city-state or a king to govern over this loose proliferation of settlements. So who are these new people? Well, of course, Joshua and Judges tells us that those are the Israelites. Those new settlements are told in those two books they settled. However, if you're a minimalist, that's inadmissible evidence. Okay? Joshua and Judges, that's myth. It's invented history. You can't believe it, so we can't appeal to that. Do we have any other evidence? Well, fortunately, we do. Fortunately, the kingdom of Egypt has told us exactly who these people are. In 1896, Sir Flinders Petrie, the same Petrie who discovered the earliest use of the alphabet, unearthed a victory stela detailing the military campaign of Pharaoh Merneptah in Canaan. The stela dates to about 1210 BC, give or take a few years. Now, this is a huge, huge stela. And you'll better see that in a photo that we have in a minute that shows a person standing in front of it. But for our purposes, what we're concentrating on is that this little white block in the bottom, because that's where it reads, Canaan has been plundered into every sort of woe, Ashkelon has been overcome, Gezer has been captured, Yanoam is made non-existent, Israel is laid waste, and his seed is not For many people, this is the earliest non-biblical reference to the people of Israel. And when you plot geographically each one of those locations, you will see that Israel is exactly in the hill country of Canaan where these new settlements have been found. And so the archaeologist Bryant Wood points out one of the more peculiar details of the stela. The word for Israel has the determinative for a people group as opposed to other names, nations, and city-states that have the determinative for the political entity. This indicates that Israel was a tribal community at this time with no fixed boundaries, perfectly in keeping with the biblical description of Israel in the Judges period. So of all the names on that entire stela, Israel is the only name that has that determinative for a people group, as opposed to a determinative indicating that it's a king or a city-state or a kingdom. The archaeologist William Deaver summarizes the present archaeological data. He notes, "The writers of Judges have described much of the actual historical process accurately. These archaeological, quote, facts on the ground correspond astonishingly well with the descriptions of daily life and overall socioeconomic conditions in the book of Judges that purport to be factual. There can be relatively little doubt today that the 12th and 11th century BC complex of highland villages and agrarian life, which he details in his book, reflects not only the Israel of the late 13th century Merneptah Stele, but also the Israel of the Hebrew Bible's period of the Judges, who he calls the Proto-Israelites at that point. Here, the convergences of the recent archaeological data and the narrative account of the book of Judges and much of 1st and 2nd Samuel are striking." Now, it was my contention that if these in fact are Israeli settlements, and we do find these inscriptions in these Israeli settlements, then it would be evidence suggesting that Israel possessed the technology to read and write, and that they were in fact utilizing it. Well, in fact, that is the scholarly opinion, that they were writing, but they were using the script of their Canaanite and Phoenician neighbors. So, for example, the distinguished epigrapher Joseph Neve stated, "The cultural values which the Hebrews adopted from the inhabitants of Canaan after the conquest of the land included the art of writing. The Hebrews wrote in a script which was used by the Canaanite or Phoenician neighbors." And these are secular people that I'm quoting, by the way. If you get the notes to my presentation in the appendix, you'll see quote after quote after quote from ancient epigraphers who affirm the same thing, including Christopher Robin, who I quoted earlier, who dismissed those other inscriptions as being Hebraic. He notes, "Some might suggest that they are surprised that a Phoenician inscription would be found in Israel. But the biblical text itself affirms that there was a substantial cultural contact between Phoenicia and Israel. The Phoenician script was used throughout much of the Mediterranean world. Thus, Israel's use of the Phoenician script was definitely part of a broader phenomenon." So when people are talking about writing and they're talking about scripts, you have three different things that you have to look at. One is you have to look at the script itself. What kind of script is it? For instance, we write in a Latin script. The Greeks write in a Greek script. Russians have their own Russian script today. You also have to think about the language that script is being written in. Our Latin script, we write it in English. Spanish is a Latin script that's written in Spanish, and so forth. And then you also have to think about, well, who was the person who was actually doing the writing? Because the person doing the writing may not be Spanish. Okay, they could be English, they might just be bilingual. Well, it's believed that the Israelites were simply using the script that was being used during that time period, which was the early alphabetic or the Phoenician script, before later during their monarchy they would develop their own national script. Okay? So therefore there is a multitude of evidence confirming Israel's existence in Canaan during the Iron Age, and these inscriptions, as well as many others found in and around the Israeli settlements dating to the period of the Judges, should be recognized as physical evidence that Israel possessed and utilized the technology of writing during this time. But what about during the late Bronze Age? which is the first half of our biblical period of the Judges. Do we have any evidence that Israel was in Canaan at that time? This is where the scholars are divided in regard to the dating of the Exodus. Your more moderate and liberal scholars, they have a late Exodus because that's where the material evidence is in Israel. Your more traditional conservative Bible scholars, they believe, the Bible tells us that they actually entered Canaan in about 1406 to 1400 BC. Is there evidence that Israel existed in Canaan during that time? Well, there's a saying in archaeology that the absence of evidence isn't necessarily evidence of absence. And what that saying is, the point that it's trying to make is that archaeology only rediscovers the smallest fraction of history. And so it's a cautionary tale that we should be very careful to make sweeping judgments based upon a limited amount of recovered or excavated data. Now, as noted previously, there's a substantial amount of archaeologically recoverable evidence showing that Israel was in Canaan during the Iron Age. Okay? Is there any evidence for Israel in Canaan during the late Bronze Age, the first half of the period of the Judges, so to speak? Well, there is, and so let's get to that. Now, before we do, from the biblical text, we know that the Israelites wandered in the wilderness for 40 years before they entered Canaan. And so you had 2 generations of Israelites who experienced a nomadic, pastoralist existence living in tents. And if you recall from the story of the Exodus, it was only those Israelites who entered Canaan because all the older generations died away, died off. So that's the experience that they were used to. Furthermore, the book of Joshua and Judges tells us that during the contest, they would attack these city-states, they would neutralize them, they would kill off the leadership, but then they would retreat and they would go back to Gilgal. They didn't initially possess and inhabit these cities that they would conquer. Okay, so apparently they continued this nomadic pastoralist existence, living in tents for at least some time as they entered the Promised Land. Now, in the book of Judges, we don't see any references to the Israelites living in homes or villages prior to chapter 6, dealing with the judge Gideon. Prior to this, the only references to dwellings describe tents. Now, my chronological daily Bible estimates the time of Gideon to be early in the 12th century, about 1184 to 1177 BC, which is precisely the time period the archaeological records show these new settlements sweeping across southern Palestine. So the scholar and Assyriologist Daniel Fleming notes, the remarkable absence of hill country settlement during the late Bronze Age does suggest a significant pastoral use of the land during that time. And it is clear that scores of new settlements at the start of the Iron One mark a strong shift toward farming. Now, there is a certain amount of uncertainty about the exact chronology of the economic shift because the material evidence for mobile pastoral subsistence is more difficult to find than that of villages of farmers. And so he makes a very important point here that people are only really starting to appreciate and acknowledge, and that is that archaeologically recoverable material existence for people who are wandering the land living in tents is much more difficult to locate and excavate than it is villages of farmers who've built houses of stone, who have manufactured terracing upon the land, who've built stone silos, who've dug out water cisterns and begun to use pottery. So if Israel continued this nomadic existence living in tents, we shouldn't be surprised that we don't find much archaeologically recoverable material evidence. Now, there's currently an excavation going on at a tell Khirbet el Mastara, and at this point, the archaeologists believe that this is one of the very earliest Israeli settlements that we have discovered. All they have found here are a couple of circular enclosures and one oval type closure. And they published an article in 2018 that was in Biblical Archaeology Review, and they expressed that part of their frustration was when they were digging and excavating within the enclosures, they couldn't find any evidence of human habitation whatsoever. They couldn't find any pottery, they couldn't find anything that would identify what those structures were being used for by the humans living inside. And so they concluded that the inhabitants probably used the enclosures to hold their livestock while they lived around them in tents. They noted that this suggests that they should change how they look at the earliest Israeli settlements, and they surmised the Israelites likely lived in tents for some time before transitioning to these dwelling structures later in the settlement process. And they concluded their article, quote, "The picture corresponds with the biblical account of Joshua through Kings." But it raises a question, well, why would they wait so long? Why would they go 100, maybe 150 years of living in tents before they started to settle down into these farming villages? Well, one possibility has been suggested that at that time the tabernacle of God was still a tent. They were still taking it up and down and moving it around, and so they didn't feel like it was morally right for them to have houses made of stone. If the house of God was still a tent. I don't know how believable that theory is, but perhaps more believable is that they didn't start to settle down into these farming villages until they began to invent or utilize the new technologies that required to do that. The terracing that you saw earlier, that required clearing off a lot of forested hill country, and you can imagine the kind of effort that it took to manufacture that terracing, to construct silos, to dig out water cisterns. So it may have been the invention and the utilization of the new technologies allowed them to transition from being this mobile pastoralist living in tents until they began to settle down in these farming villages. Now that's a plausible explanation of why we don't find very much archaeologically recoverable evidence for Israel in the hill country of Canaan at that time. But is there any other non-biblical evidence that we can appeal to? Well, in the late 1800s, over 300 cuneiform tablets were discovered in Pharaoh's library at Amarna, Egypt, and these have become known as the Amarna Letters. Many of these tablets were a series of communications between the leaders of city-states in Canaan and the Pharaoh. Now, these tablets were very interesting because in many, the Canaanite leaders were pleading to the Pharaoh for help from an attacking group called the Habiru, also known as the Apiru in Egyptian. Of course, the name Habiru is very similar to the name Hebrew. These tablets were dated to the mid-14th century, the approximate biblical time frame of Joshua and the early period of the Judges. Now, initially, these created a real stir in the academic and the scholarly community because it appeared to be non-biblical archaeological evidence confirming the conquest of Judges and the early military conquest of the Judges, the period of the Judges. However, over time, more tablets were discovered that referred to the Habiru. Some of those tablets dated as early as about the 1800s BC. Other tablets were found in locations where it wouldn't make any sense to equate them with the Israelites or the Hebrews because they just simply weren't there at that time. So, most scholars today agree that the expression Habiru does not refer to an ethnic people, but instead it refers to an undesirable social element. It's a generic term. It's always used as a derogatory or a pejorative term. So over time, as more archaeologists subscribe to the late Exodus based upon the demographic explosion in the 12th century, then equating the Habiru of the Amarna Letters with the Israelites fell out of favor because they just felt like they couldn't be referring to the Israelites because the Israelites weren't in Canaan at that time. The Israelites were only there about 150 years later. However, one can't help but notice the striking similarities between the actions of the Habiru described in the Amarna Letters with the actions of the Israelites as described in the book of Joshua and Judges. For example, the same type of political structure that's described in Joshua and the Judges are alluded to in the Amarna Letters. Time and again, the Habiru are described as attempting to overcome city-states and expel their kings. They are portrayed as a negative element that's wreaking havoc in Canaan. Rulers continually fear some towns joining up with the Habiru or making treaties with them, as some are described as doing in Joshua and Judges. The Habiru were described as a mobile population dispersed to the countryside, exactly as they're described in Joshua and Judges. The letters refer to the, quote, chiefs of the Habiru. This appears to acknowledge a clan or a tribal relationship among the Hebiru, again, similar to the tribes of Israel. And probably more specifically, very similar to the idea of the judges that are portrayed in the book of Judges, because those were clan or tribal military leaders. The biblical phrase, kings of Canaan, that's found in Joshua and Judges, is duplicated in the Amarna Letters. This is a really interesting point. There is a significant silence from places in central Palestine where the armies of Joshua had already overrun. In other words, there are no cries for help from already defeated city-states as described in the Bible. The situation at Gezer correlates very well with the situation described in Joshua. Just as Joshua was unable to conquer Gezer, we're also told the Hebiru failed to take it. The letters speak of the Hebiru gaining power throughout the country. One letter refers to a leader, quote, who gave Shechem to the Hebiru. Now, the Bible doesn't mention any military conquest of Shechem. However, it does, from the very beginning, describe Israel possessing and utilizing Shechem. This tablet may help to explain why the Israelites possessed it. One scholar has noted that the tie-in with biblical history is striking. Even scholars who do not believe that the Hebiru of the Amarna Letters are referring to the Israelites, nevertheless do acknowledge that there are striking similarities between the actions of the two. So, for example, the Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen notes, there are clear behavioral analogies between these Apiru and the displaced Hebrews who had left Egypt and now sought to establish themselves in Canaan. And Professor Nadev Naaman confesses, with their status as uprooted people living on the margins of society, the bands described in the book of Judges and Samuel are identical to the Hebiru of the ancient Near Eastern texts. So in summary, there appear to be two main reasons why scholars are hesitant or reticent to equate the Hebiru of the Amarna Letters with the Hebrews, with the Israelites. First, it does seem that the term does not refer to an ethnic people, but instead is a generic term referring to an undesirable element like the terms raiders or bandits or even terrorists, if you will. However, from the Canaanite perspective, this term could still be accurately describing the actions of the Israelites because they were in fact wreaking havoc all throughout Canaan. Now this is interesting, something I learned in this study as a matter of fact. We don't know where the term Hebrews came from. We don't know how the Israelites came to be called the Hebrews. That's a matter of academic speculation at this point. Now, Professor Naaman, who I quoted earlier, he does not believe that the Hebiru are the Israelites, but he does believe that the Israelites descended from the Hebiru. And he believed that they took the name Hebrews because that was the nickname that was given to them, being called the Hebiru. And as you know about nicknames tend to stick, whether you like them or not, and some people just tend to accept them. The other reason is that convinced that the Israelites only show up in the archaeological record during the 12th century, they believe that the Hebiru are too early to be Israelites. However, as noted, there may be very good reasons why the Israelites don't show up in the archaeological record. And this skepticism also completely ignores the ancient witness of the books of Joshua and Judges, and we'll talk about that more here in a moment. So Professor Douglas Waterhouse notes, if it could be shown that the biblical Hebrews were an active presence in the land of Canaan during the time of the Amarna age, then the case would become much more attractive in identifying at least some of the references to the Hebiru as referring to the Israelites. So do we have that sort of evidence? Well, again, we have the book of Joshua and Judges who tells us that exact same thing, but for the minimalists, that's not admitted into the record. They will not consider that. That's not considered to be evidence. Well, recall how earlier we talked about the Merneptah Stele and how a lot of people think that that's the earliest non-biblical reference to Israel as a people? Well, an Egyptian statue pedestal sitting in the Berlin Museum was re-examined by Manfred Gorg of the University of Munich, and it was published in a German paper recently in 2001. The pedestal contained, 3 names from Palestine reminiscent of the Merneptah Stele. The first two names are Ashkelon and Canaan. The third name was only partially preserved due to hacking, but Gorg argued that the third name was an archaic form of the name Israel, and argued that it may have been copied during the 19th dynasty from an even earlier list. Now, in 2001, Gorg's initial interpretation was hotly debated. It received a lot of scholarly pushback. There were a lot of people that thought that he was incorrect. He was being over-aggressive. However, in the years following that, more corroborative evidence had been discovered, and so in 2010, he republished his theory along with two other German professors who joined him. They published that in the Journal of Ancient Egyptian Interconnections, and this time they included this corroborative evidence that one did seem to show that that was referring to an archaic form of Israel, and also the evidence that showed that that was probably copied from an earlier list, probably predating Merneptah Stele by about 200 years. So in the summation of their paper, they note, if the name refers to biblical Israel, and if it was located in Canaan, as seems to be indicated by its association with Ashkelon and Canaan, and if the names had been copied from an earlier source, which is supported by the archaic orthography of all three names on the slab, which they go into much more detail in their paper, this would indeed suggest that the Proto-Israelites had migrated to Canaan sometime during the middle of the second millennium BC, which is exactly when Joshua and the Judges indicate that it happened. If this find holds up to scrutiny, then this would be the sort of evidence that Professor Waterhouse said could be used to justify the belief that at least some of the references to the Habiru and the Amarna Letters are in fact referring to the Israelites or the actions of the Israelites. So in closing, what I would like to do is to summarize just some of the main points in this presentation. First of all, some Bible critics have claimed that Israel lacked the technology to write until the 9th century BC. Therefore, the contents of the Bible were likely transmitted orally for hundreds of years and thus likely to have been heavily distorted, or maybe nothing but myth and historical invention with no basis in reality. But archaeological discoveries over the past 100 years seem to support the biblical assertion that the Israelites did possess the technology to write and appear to be teaching and learning alphabet writing at least as early as the 13th and 12th centuries. Now, although we didn't have time to develop this point in the presentation, there does appear to be evidence for a long scribal tradition within Canaan, which includes Israel. We have found numerous inscriptions within the Israelite territory, but a lot of these inscriptions only have just a few letters on them. They're not writing out anything. For instance, we found bowls that have a few letters inscribed. We found arrowheads that have maybe 3 letters inscribed. We found jar handles that have a couple of letters. We found actually a game, an actual board game that had the owner's name inscribed in alphabetic writing. And so the point being is that it would seem to be foolish to think that writing was prevalent all around Canaan at this time, but those dumb hillbillies, those Israelites, didn't possess or utilize the technology of writing, that they couldn't read or write. And so these discoveries greatly undermine, well, I missed a spot there. So Professor Kyle McCarter confirms inland Canaan had a long history of alphabetic literacy prior to the 10th century BCE. Even if we restrict ourselves to the last 3 centuries before the turn of the millennium, that is the 13th through the 11th centuries, we can compile an ample and diverse list of inscribed artifacts recovered from inland sites, which taken together constitute a substantial corpus of old Canaanite epigraphic materials. And so these discoveries greatly undermine one of the main premises of the documentary hypothesis. Professor Wybray confirms the argument that a large part of the Pentateuchal narratives must have been formed, transmitted, and developed orally from very ancient times because writing was not used for such purposes has been shown to be fallacious. It is based partly on selective use of evidence. Further, the notion that early Israel in particular was a primitive nomadic people to whom the art of writing must have been unknown has been shown as a result of recent study to be misconceived. And we also have a very good amount of correspondence between the archaeological record and the descriptions that we find in Joshua and Judges. And so the archaeologist William Dever affirms, and he's specifically referring to the period of the Judges, the historical memory of the Bible is accurate by and large. I am convinced that however much they may have been edited or even composed largely by later post-exilic schools bearing the prophets' names, they reflect a real historical setting, and in some cases much earlier, and certainly going back to the Iron Age. Now, although less substantial, there is archaeological evidence to corroborate the existence in Canaan during the 14th and 13th centuries. The archaeological record is consistent with this pastoral, tinted, nomadic existence. The descriptions of the Habiru during this time correlates well with the actions of the Israelites during the period of the Judges. And we appear to have an Egyptian pedestal which may confirm the existence of Israel and Canaan at that time. And in addition to the archaeological record, the books of Joshua and Judges are an ancient textual witness, or at least they should be. It would be nothing short of prejudice to accept the ancient historical records of Egypt, Assyria, and Babylonia, etc., but then to discount, to trivialize or minimalize these historical records of Israel because at some later date they've been assembled and put together in this religious document called the Bible. Now, the final question that we will ask is, could Moses have written a large part of the Pentateuchal narratives that we traditionally understand him to have done? Well, recently there's been a documentary attempting to address this question. This documentary was called, I think, The Moses Question, if I remember correctly. And the filmmaker Timothy Mahoney, throughout the documentary, is interviewing Christopher Ralston, the internationally respected epigrapher that I quoted previously. In one of his exchanges, this was an email exchange, Mahoney asked him, for the sake of argument, if Moses was responsible for writing at least part of the Torah, sorry about that, in your view, could the Proto-Sinaitic script have been used to perform the task? Ralston replied, yes. The script Moses could have used or would have been early alphabetic, not Hebrew. Now again, early alphabetic is Proto-Canaanite. The other thing to notice is how Ralston actually corrects Mahoney in the answer to the question. So Mahoney asked him if he would have used the Proto-Sinaitic script. Well, the Proto-Sinaitic script predated Moses. That would have been more the time period of Joseph. And he answered him, pointing out, no, it would have been the early alphabetic script or the Proto-Canaanite script that he used. And interesting, Ralston volunteered, by the way, I believe that Moses was historical and that he was literate. This final point will be a good introduction to our next part of the biblical archaeology series, and we're going to be taking a look at the evidence for Israel in Egypt as well as the evidence for the Exodus. So again, if you are interested in the notes, they're over there. We don't charge anything specifically for the notes. We just simply ask for donations. If you have $3, $4, or $5 and you're willing to donate those to grab the notes, please. If you don't have any money and you can't afford that, please take the notes. Our compliments. I'd much rather you have them than not have them. Now, if you all have the microphones ready, we'll take some questions. She asked about Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 6 through 9. And so let me read that for you. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them to your foreheads. Write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates. So her question was, did they have an alphabetic script at the time that Moses wrote that? And did they actually do this? The majority scholarly opinion is that that is not meant to be taken literally, and that you're supposed to do all of those items literally, but that this is figuratively telling everybody this is something that should be on your heart. It specifically said to write it on your heart. Are you supposed to take that literally? Did they have surgeries and write it on their hearts? No, they didn't. They think that it's something that, yes, you need to talk to your children about this. That needs to be something that that generation needs to learn, and then the generation after them needs to learn, and so on and so forth. And to write it on your hand or to write it on your forehead is symbolic of when people see you, this is something you should be talking about. This is something that people should recognize, okay? So the general belief is that, one, they did not expect them to do that literally. However, naturally, there are people who do take it literally. So sometimes you might see a sect of Hebrews that will have this little leather box that's tied around their wrist, or sometimes a leather box will be tied around their forehead, and within that leather box will be these strips of verses, commandments that are inside that. And so they take that very literally. And incidentally, the very earliest copy of Scripture that we have is from 600 BC, and it's a pair of tiny silver scrolls that were used as amulets. It's called the Aaronic benediction. Aaron, the brother of Moses, the Aaronic benediction, that as amulets were used to bundle them together, sort of like a cigarette. They would roll them up, sort of like a cigarette, and then they would literally tie those around their forehead. So there are some people who did that and still do that literally. But the expectation was that they probably didn't write that on their tents or their homes when they settled into villages. However, could they have? The Proto-Canaanite script was available at that time. We're going to be talking about this a little bit more next in the next presentation, talking about Moses and the sort of technology he had, that he possessed, that we believe that he utilized. And so I hope that answers the question, Peggy? Okay, excellent. And so anybody else, if you'll raise your hand, they'll bring you a microphone.
So actually, I have a question, and so another rule of the chapter is he who has a
LD?
microphone can ask a question.
Okay.
Because I'll forget if I don't ask now.
Okay.
So I'm not a biblical scholar, and some of y'all may know this, but wasn't there a reference that the children of Israel, when they conquered a land, even though the ones who possessed that area of Israel had conquered it, they couldn't settle yet. The men had to travel with the other tribes to go conquer the whole of Israel. So that might explain some of the wandering that occurred for a while. And the second question is going to be, we know that Moses was Pharaoh's adopted son. What would have been the education and the language that he would have had in Egypt that he would have then taken with him to Canaan? Okay,
so if you'll help me to remember the second question, I'll start with the first question, which I've already almost forgot.
Okay. About the children of Israel,
yes,
the man could not settle until they conquered the whole of Israel.
Right. So you have Joshua and Judges. And so William Deaver, who's that secular archaeologist that I quoted, he thinks Joshua is a complete fabrication and it's not true. Judges, he thinks, is amazingly accurate and corresponds well with the biblical record. And so Joshua as a book is the most criticized, because if you read Joshua, it sounds like the Israelites came into Canaan like a bunch of stormtroopers, and they conquered all of these cities, and they took over, and they were boss, right? So when you read it on the surface, that's what it sounds like. Now, when you start to pay attention to the details in Joshua itself, they do mention specific locations within the territory that were not conquered. And then when you get to Judges, Judges starts off by talking about all of the territories that were not conquered by Joshua. And so the critics of the Bible tend to take Joshua literally the way we modernists would read it and take it literally. Kenneth Kitchen is an Egyptologist, and he has an excellent book called On the Reliability of the Old Testament. And he points out that type of writing, those type of declarations in the ancient Near East that you find in Joshua is very similar to the writing that you find in other time periods, where when they are boasting about their triumphs, it is complete destruction. Okay, they're going in, they wiped them out, they don't exist. As a matter of fact, a perfect example is the Merneptah Stele. If y'all remember the descriptions on the Merneptah Stele, each one of those places, it essentially said, they destroyed them. They no longer exist. They were laid to waste. Their seed is not. That was a very common way of describing victories, and the book of Joshua uses that same sort of language. So it would be wrong to misinterpret the intent of that language. We shouldn't read it through modern day spectacles. We should read it through the eyes of the people who wrote it and what was familiar and common to them and how they used it. We tend to use that analogy in sports analogies. We talk about one team destroyed another team or things of that nature, okay? So, yes, there were unconquered territories. There were clans who, yes, they went and neutralized this city-state, like Jericho, but they didn't immediately inhabit and possess Jericho. There actually are only 3 city-states that are described that they actually destroyed. And that was Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor. The others, they probably were more like the Egyptians. The Egyptians, when they went in and conquered territory, they normally didn't destroy it because they wanted to set up a vassal kingdom. They wanted the people there to then continue their lifestyle in paying them tribute. And so they were thinking that they probably didn't destroy those others because eventually they would probably want to move in, just not immediately. And Kenneth does a really good job of pointing all the verses that describe that more accurately. And so he says that's been a misunderstanding with scholars, that they read it too literally and they don't read it from the eyes of an ancient. Your second one.
What would a pharaoh
Right. So Moses very likely would have learned the hieroglyphic picture, the hieroglyphic Egyptian system, okay? However, what is clear is that among the lay people, they were learning this new alphabetic script. And so one of the questions has been, how long did it take them to exit Egypt and then enter Canaan? Prior to last year, the earliest examples that we had in Canaan were from the 13th century. And there was a big gap between the 19th century and the 13th century, and there was a big gap in the evolution of the hieroglyphs into the Proto-Canaanite early alphabetic letters. Well, actually, last year, they found another inscription at Lachish, which dated to the 15th century, which is exactly the time period that the Israelites would have entered Canaan. Not to say that the Israelites had anything to do with that inscription, but it was a very important piece in the evolution of the alphabet. It was very important to demonstrate that the alphabet had reached Canaan by that time. It probably reached Canaan before the Israelites got there. We just maybe haven't found the evidence yet. But the belief is that Moses probably learned the hieroglyphic system as a student in Egypt, and then he probably learned the alphabetic system from other Semites, probably Semites within the Israelite tribes and other Semites that happened to be living in Egypt at that time. And then that was frankly the easier medium. It was easier to teach other people. And so perhaps the Levites, who may have been the tribe responsible for recording the history, perhaps it was much easier for them to pick it up and start recording the history for Israel. Yes, sir.
Hey, John. Okay, on the development of scripts.
Yeah.
Okay, on the development of scripts, understanding that the medium tends to define the development itself. So obviously what you're writing in stone or clay tablet is going to be different potentially from something like on papyri. Do we have any evidence of perhaps a parallel and divergent development of scripts at the same time where say an alphabetic script is used on papyri whereas hieroglyphic would be on stone or clay?
Is that the question?
That's
Okay.
the question.
Okay, so yes. I mentioned that in 1916, Alan Gardner was able to decipher the Proto-Sinaitic script and figure out how it's working. Actually, one of the things that led to that is that they found a small sphinx that on one side of the sphinx had the hieroglyphic writing on it, And then on the other side of the screen, someone came up to that monument, sort of like graffiti, and alphabetically wrote out something that was very similar to the expression on the other side. It wasn't word for word identical, but it was pretty close. And that was a big key in helping to decipher the alphabetic script. The alphabetic script did make its way to Ugarit in cuneiform form. So those cuneiform marks, in the 13th century, we see Ugarit using those alphabetically as well. And you make a very good point about the papyrus. With the lay people, they would have likely used papyrus. So we don't have any long writings from lay people. So some people have said, well, they probably couldn't write out stories. But the truth is if they would have written out stories, it would have been on papyrus, and papyrus is notably extremely difficult to preserve, especially in the delta, the Nile Delta, where it's very humid and there's a lot of wetness and water and so forth. I think in the whole of Israel and Canaan, there's only been one papyrus ever discovered that dates to like the 9th or 10th century. They just aren't going to survive. And so that's why we have so many more hieroglyphs in cuneiform, because those are written on clay tablets, and those preserve. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
John, I got a question. Talk about Joseph and his education in hieroglyphics. How did the Rosetta Stone, what's your understanding of how the Rosetta Stone fit in?
Yeah, so my understanding of the Rosetta Stone is that Rosetta Stone is a stone that had it was a trilingual inscription, and that the Rosetta Stone was the key to unlocking Egyptian hieroglyphs. And so that led to us unlocking it, and then we learned more. Once you sort of get those kernels, then you can start putting the pieces together. And so that was a huge part of that. But I don't think there was anything on that referring to the alphabetic discovery. But yeah, that was huge. And as a matter of fact, a lot of the foreign languages, ancient languages that we've been able to decipher are because we found bilingual or trilingual inscriptions somewhere that was the key to us learning what it was they were saying. Yes?
You might already answered or spoken on. Was there some feeling that alphabetic records would be more reliable? And I know they said that the scribes would count letters and make sure they didn't add anything, but was anybody implying that hieroglyphics wouldn't be a good way to keep history because it would be less accurate or something like that?
No, there's really nothing to that extent. At this point, it really is just pure speculation at how the alphabet was born and what led to it. But I haven't heard of anything that suggested that they transitioned from hieroglyphs to the alphabetic nature because of accuracy. I think that a lot of people think those Egyptian records are pretty accurate. The Sumerian records, a lot of that is very accurate. So interestingly, though, I will mention this. So this documentary that I talked about is a very recent documentary called The Moses Question. And the filmmaker Timothy Mahoney, this is a part of a series of DVDs called The Patterns of Evidence. And this DVD came out maybe 2 years ago, and it's educational and it's interesting, but I would caution you, I'm really interested in intellectual honesty. Okay, I'm not here to prove your faith is true. That's not my responsibility. I am interested in the truth and the evidence, and I don't want to extend the evidence beyond what the evidence really is. I want to be honest, and I don't want to say anything here that you'll go to somebody else who will say, yeah, that's complete, bull. Nobody believes that. There were a couple of things in that documentary that made me uncomfortable about his presentation. So just so you know, one of the things was he tried to make it sound like Joseph probably had something to do with inventing the alphabet. Okay, we have no evidence of that. The evidence was that some people there at the turquoise mines of El Sarim probably did it. The guess at this point is that it was a smart Semite who did not know Egyptian hieroglyphs, but nevertheless saw those pictures representing certain things. And so, this picture represented this person, And so from that, he could look at the sound of a word, and he would use that picture to represent this consonant, if you will. And so it was a brilliant stroke of genius by this person who was trying to figure out a way to communicate. And so it's a somewhat controversial theory that it was just unschooled, uneducated lay people that just all of a sudden found a new medium to communicate via this very simple alphabet. So one of the things was, again, that Joseph was responsible for that. Another thing that he tried to insinuate was that Israel, not Phoenicia, was probably responsible for the formalization and the standardization of the alphabet, and it radiated out because of Israel. And the third thing was he referred to something called the Admonitions of I Pure. The Admonitions of I Pure is a document that is a poetic document, and it describes some very dramatic, apocalyptic happenings in Egypt. And a lot of it is similar to the plagues of Egypt. Okay? So the first time I heard about it, I was like, wow, man, that's fantastic. People ought to know about that. And I used it in one of my very first apologetics presentations. But I noticed that since then, whenever I read good, credentialed scholars talking about the evidence of Israel and Egypt, that is never mentioned, ever. And so as I began to look into it, I learned that's because that document dates to about the time of Joseph, not to the time of Moses. And he appeals to that in the theory as if that is evidence of the plagues of Israel. And there are very few scholars that believe that that has any credibility whatsoever. So for me, that was very disappointing. And another thing that he did was that he talked about how important it was for the Christian faith and for people to hold the Christian faith. And it almost sounded like, we really need to believe these things in order for the Christian faith to be valid. But none of the things that he was emphasizing, I thought, had anything to do whatsoever with the Christian faith or the Jewish faith or the reliability of the books of the Bible. I thought he overextended himself in what he was trying to prove. So if y'all watch that, those are just my thoughts and critiques. There is a lot of very interesting things in the documentary that are true. It's just the way that he connects the dots that I objected to.
Just to bend the rules, just a quick one. When I was in college, about all I remember about history was that they said there was something called historiography, which is you've got to study history because the person that writes it is not going to be a neutral source. So, and politics isn't history, but I heard certain presidents say we were energy independent for some number of years. And then just last week, another official with a different axe to grind said that we're making more oil now than we were during that period. So you can see that politics enters in. So are any of these scholars that don't like Joshua anti-Zionists? Or, is there a backstory to it?
Yeah. So a very good question. And unfortunately, this subject has become very politicized. Very politicized. And if you're familiar with politics, the truth has no place in politics. The truth is what I want you to think it is in politics. And both sides are guilty of that. Okay, we have conservative Christians who will completely ignore the truth and just sets my teeth on edge when I hear them talk. And then you have people on the other side. So from this particular discussion, I would tell you that the biblical minimalists, there are a lot of anti-Semitic people that are biblical minimalists. They want to undermine the history of Israel, that Israel has any sort of claim in that territory of Palestine, and it doesn't matter what sort of evidence you find that confirms that they existed as a people, they're not going to believe it, they're not going to accept it. Either they're going to say that it's fraudulent, or they're going to say that, for instance, the Merneptah Stele, well, that's not this Israel. That's a different Israel. It's not this Israel, is what a lot of them say. Now, the scholars who believe the documentary hypothesis, I think a lot of those scholars are trying to be intellectually honest. I think that it was a very novel theory when it first came out. One of the things that you will find when you read the people who subscribe to the documentary hypothesis, there is no one hypothesis that everyone agrees to. There are versions of the hypothesis. You know, you got this version, you got this version, you got this version, and each one of those versions are critical of the other versions and point out why they're wrong and incorrect. Okay, so they do a really good job of showing how unbelievable the hypothesis is by tearing each other's version of the hypothesis apart. So Wybray, who I quoted, he's given a lot of credit for completely destroying the documentary hypothesis. But a lot of scholars still hold on to that version or another. Another thing about that scholarly community is that your name doesn't become known. It isn't recognized until you come up with a different theory than what's already traditionally thought or accepted. You become known in history because you've come up with something new. And so there's an advantage to come up with a new and novel theory and trying to promote that theory, because then all of a sudden your name is in the academic circles. And if somewhere along the line the evidence starts to become more supportive and corroborative of that, then you will be remembered. People don't remember a whole lot the people who had wrong theories that never, came in. But, it's a gamble for some of these people. I do think that many of them are trying to be intellectually honest. But sometimes I think they hold on to those versions of their theory well after the evidence fails to support it and support others. So hopefully I answered your question.
So John, I know RTB is really big about testable models. So what should we look for in the years to come for things that are going to support certain things, not support certain things? What do you think is on the horizon that we should be aware of?
Yeah, so I love archaeology, and I love reading about new discoveries. And one of the things that you have to be careful of is that when you get a new discovery, you need to hold it loosely, okay? Because initially there's going to be an interpretation of that new discovery, but eventually there may be some further evidence that either undermines it, you may find more that actually corroborates it. In the future, I would be watching the news to see what sort of new discoveries come up. My dad this morning picked up my current issue of Biblical Archaeology Review, which is a secular magazine, and on the cover it said Jesus found in Arabia. His initial thought was, somebody's claiming they found Jesus' body in Arabia. Well, that would be interesting. That would be quite the find. Well, when he opened it up, it was actually an inscription referring to Jesus was found in Arabia in about 5 years. It was a very early inscription. It was newsworthy, but it wasn't, what he initially thought. And so there will be headline-grabbing news that you'll have to dig into. Last year, there were a couple of great discoveries. Last year, they found that 15th century inscription. That was considered one of the top 10 finds of archaeology last year. Another find last year was they found an inscription referring to Gideon that dates to the 12th century, the time of Gideon. Now, that inscription was found about 100 miles north of where we think the biblical Gideon probably lived. So, as a truth-following Christian, you should be very careful that when some of these announcements come up, if people continue to say, we found evidence of biblical Gideon, that's not what we found. Okay, we found an inscription that refers to his name, actually refers to his nickname as described in the Bible. What that is that persons with that name living in that time period were there at the time, which corresponds with what the Bible says. So at this point, that's what the evidence says. If you read any Christians that say that we have archaeological evidence that the judge Gideon has been found, has been verified, that's wrong. Okay, so in the future, what I'd say is when you see these headline news, if you hear something really big like that, another example would be from years ago, they found the ossuary that James, the brother of Jesus, was probably buried in. That has been an interesting story that has played out over the course of 15 plus years. And so initially it was this huge find, considered one of the greatest archaeological discoveries ever, and then they decided it was a fraud. And then they actually took the guy to court who owned the ossuary. So the belief was that the ossuary that it belonged to James, the son of Joseph, the brother of Jesus. The assertion was that the ossuary did have an ancient inscription that said James, the son of Joseph, but that someone added the brother of Jesus. And so that was the contention that it was a fraud, okay? And it went to trial. And in the middle of the trial, the prosecution's expert witness was shown some very detailed, high-resolution photography of that inscription that was considered to be forged, and he confirmed in the trial that there was ancient patina found within those letters, which he had not seen before. And it was one of those Perry Mason mic drop moments in the trial where the judge actually looked at the prosecution and said, "Are you still going to continue?" And in the end, he was found innocent. Right now, the majority opinion is that that box is probably authentic. So again, when you have these big announcements, hold on to it loosely, and then pay attention to the news later as scholars get to critique it and get to verify it. You again.
Yeah, me again. I got a lot of questions. One of the archaeologists that I follow writes that we see, especially on YouTube, Noah's Ark is found, or Pharaoh's golden chariot has been found at the bottom of the Red Sea. Cautions that a lot of people are intentionally putting false information up because that way they can embarrass Christians who glom onto it, and then it can be proved false. So for the lay person, how do they judge the veracity of sources of information?
Yes. So before I mentioned the admonitions of eye pure. You'll read about that on those sites that talk about the chariot wheels being found in the Red Sea, that talk about pieces of Noah's Ark being found, that talk about how the Ark of the Covenant is in this building in Africa, and those types of things. They're very sensational stories that don't have any sort of proof. The internet is not your best source for information. I hope I don't have to really reinforce that. One of my things as a Christian apologist is that I've begun to learn the scholars that I think that I can trust versus the ones that I've lost my trust. And I don't like to read those anymore. Sometimes I'll read them just to see what they're saying. One way to decide who you can trust is that you will find other, on the political spectrum, you've got the extremists on each end, and then in the middle, you've got people that are really trying to be intellectually honest. And then some of those might be on your side of the political spectrum, some of them might be on the other side. But oftentimes you can see a good dialogue going back and forth between those people trying to be respectful and intellectually honest. And when you read those, I think that really helps you to separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, and to figure out which are the things that you can have confidence in and what are the things that you should be careful with. So when I talk about the Habiru possibly referring to the Israelites, in my notes I put quotes of several scholars who do not believe that the Habiru are the Israelites. And so I want you to hear that perspective. And then I quote the scholars who do believe that they are. And so right now the majority opinion is that they're not, but my problem with that is the reasons why they don't think it is, I think, are not very good reasons. And when even the scholars who don't think that the Habiru are referring to the Israelites acknowledge, but the actions of the Habiru are identical to the actions of the Israelites, I think that is evidence. That's worthy of consideration and something to hold loosely and see what else comes up, what else we discover. That Egyptian pedestal in Berlin was a fascinating discovery. And it's interesting to read their peer-reviewed paper detailing the evidence. And those are the type of discoveries just in my lifetime that are new and exciting and that you get to hear about. I love it. I love reading about it. Anybody else? One more question? Have we already had one question too many? Thank you all very much for coming. Again, the notes are available over there on the table. Please come back next week for Dr.